All right, let's jump right into this back half lecture of the Harvard CS50X 2025 HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for week 8. This is the part 2 of a 2-part lecture watch along. So let's go ahead and dive right on in.
What are called regular expressions to help solve this problem. A regular expression is a pattern, otherwise known as a regex for short, that allows you to validate input from users and make sure that that input matches some pattern. And this is a bit of a mouthful how you can do these. There's a whole bunch of documentation online, not only at this URL, but in Python's own documentation and in other locations as well. But just wanted to give you a taste of the possibilities because these are really everywhere in high-level programming nowadays, as well as in this context of HTML. Here is the symbology of regular expressions. We're not in a language. It's just a way of representing patterns, if you will. If you have a dot in a string of text that's a regular expression, that just means any character. It's like a wild card. Any one character can be there. A star actually means 0 or more times. So you can say, give me a character 0 or more times. So there's either nothing there, or there's 1, or there's 2, or there's more. You can use a plus, which means give me 1 or more characters. So not 0, but 1 or more. You can use a question mark, which means 0 or 1 character, but that's it. You can use curly braces, unrelated to Python, and say, I want this many occurrences of a character. And you can have a range inside of curly braces. Give me minimally this many characters, maximally this one. And you can do other things too. In square brackets, you can say, give me any one of these digits, 0 through 9 in this case, but you could type anything in there that you want. You could say 0-9 to specify a whole range without having to type them all out. You can type \d to indicate any digit, so you don't have to type any of that out. Or you can do the opposite, \D, which means anything except a digit. So long story short, and I'm very much waving my hands at some of the details here, there's this whole symbology that humans have come up with in different languages via which you can represent patterns. So this is all to say that I could come up with my own pattern for an email address, even though it's not going to be as good as the browser's own. Let me go back to VS Code here. Instead of saying email type equals email, let me go back.
Go back here to some of these other ones real quickly.
And say, I want this many occurrences of a character. And you can have a range inside of curly braces. Give me minimally this many characters, maximally this one. And you can do other things too. In square brackets, give me minimally this many characters, maximally this one. And you can do other things too. In square brackets, you can say, give me any one of these digits, 0 through 9 in this case, but you could type anything in there that you want. You could say 0-9 to specify a whole range without having to type them all out. You can type \D to indicate any digit, so you don't have to type any of that out. Or you can do the opposite, \D, which means anything except a digit. So long story short, and I'm very much waving my hands at some of the details here, there's this whole symbology that humans have come up with in different languages via which you can represent patterns. So this is all to say that I could come up with my own pattern for an email address, even though it's not going to be as good as the browser's own. Let me go back to VS Code here. Instead of saying email type equals email, let me go back to type equals text. Or heck, I can go to the default and get rid of this altogether. But I'm going to use one other attribute we haven't yet seen, which is literally pattern equals quote unquote. Inside of this pattern's value, I can use a regular expression, a pattern that represents what kinds of values I want to accept. Now, I'm going to keep this simple and therefore not very good. But remember that dot means any character. Plus means 1 or more of any character. An @ means literally an @. Another dot means any character. Another plus means 1 or more of any character. Then \edu. What's going on here? Well, we haven't seen this yet. But curiously, if I want to literally have a period in the user's input, well, I can't use dot because that means any character. It was a wild card. So just like in C, just like in Python, I have to escape certain characters. So in regular expressions, if I do \dot, that means give me a literal dot in the user's input, an actual period. And then edu means make sure that the user's email address, in this case, ends with .edu. Now, this is a bit of a simplification because it is not the case in email addresses that you can allow for any 1 or more characters, then an @, and then any 1 or more characters, and then .edu. it's actually more formally defined than that. So this is a very quick and dirty regular expression for an email address.
Quick and dirty.
However, if I now go back to my register page and reload, and I again try to type in David and not an invalid email address, that pattern will be checked, and the browser will prevent the form from submitting at all. So I can express different patterns of things. Now, for email, that's not the best thing, because in fact, if I actually look at the official definition of an email address's regular expression, according to browsers, it's actually this crazy long sequence of text using the symbols I showed you as well as some others. But this just speaks to how complicated the definition of an email address's pattern is. So using type equals quote unquote email, definitely the better bet. But let me do something a little more reasonable. If I go back to VS Code here, and let's suppose that we want to ask the user not for an email address, but their phone number. So let me change the placeholder to be phone, for instance, and then let me change the pattern to be that of a US phone number. So here I could do this in a bunch of ways, but I'm going to use \d, which means any digit, and then curly braces 3 times. Then a hyphen, then a \d, curly braces 3, then a hyphen, then \d, curly braces 4. And this here represents a standard format for a US-based phone number, 3 digits, dash 3 digits, dash 4 digits. So this is how I can now ensure that the human types in not an email address, and definitely not their name, but a phone number that at least follows a certain pattern. Maybe not very user-friendly, because do you really want to require the user to type in dashes? Wouldn't it be nice if they can skip those? Maybe they want to use parentheses. So there's better ways, arguably, still to do this. The point here, though, is that web pages and other programming languages more broadly do support these things called regular expressions, which are wonderfully useful in the real world. But there is a danger here. Suppose that even though this catches invalid phone numbers now, register,
tell you valid format.
It's telling me to match the requested format. Unfortunately, as great as all these features are, these patterns are that I just introduced, you as web developers now should never trust users' input. Why? The only thing stopping the user from typing in invalid data, like their name instead of their email, or their name instead of a phone number, or something else invalid, is the code that they've downloaded to their browser. But recall that even though when they view page source, they see exactly what came from your website, they can open their own browser's developer tools via inspect here. They can go to those elements and, for instance, expand the form by clicking this triangle. And if they don't like the pattern you're imposing on them, well, let me just go ahead in there, delete that, hit enter. OK, watch what happens now. I have modified the in-memory version of the web page. I can click register now all I want. And I have just submitted DAVID instead of a phone number. So this is to say, unfortunately, that this week alone, we do not yet have enough skills, enough knowledge to correctly validate user input. We can make the experience more user-friendly. We can tell them right away in the browser, you're doing something wrong. Please don't submit this form yet. But we're also going to need, before long, a server-side mechanism for defending against that kind of attack too. So through phishing, and in this case through modification of the actual DOM in memory, we've seen all too readily how adversaries can try to infiltrate our sites in some way. Now, in addition to the developer tools that come with your own browser, it's worth noting that there is at least one official source via which you can validate your actual HTML. That is to say, make sure that it is well-formed and that it actually adheres to the HTML spec. At validator.w3.org is a web-based tool that you can use to copy-paste your HTML, even paste the URLs of web pages into. And this is actually a tool that will provide you with some feedback as to whether or not you've made syntactic errors with your actual code. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll introduce stylization of these pages, namely through CSS. All right, we are back, and it's time now to start stylizing these web pages so that they're not just these boring black and white pages that have structure to them, but really no style. And so for this, what we're going to do is introduce another language called CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, which is another language, but not a programming language, via which you can specify how certain tags should be appearing on the screen. For instance, we've already seen tags like H1, H2, H3, and I described those as big and bold, and not quite as big and bold, and not quite quite as big and bold. But what do we mean by bold and big? It would be nice if we could actually use font sizes or pixel sizes. It would be nice if we could introduce colors and other aesthetics. And indeed, CSS allows you to adorn the structure of your page with the last mile of detail, so to speak. The colors, the sizing, the spacing, the positioning, and so much more. Now, in order to do this, we're going to need to introduce one other term of art, namely properties. And frankly, at this point, we're just coming up with different words for the same ideas in all of these various languages. But properties are sets of, not surprisingly, key value pairs. A property allows you to specify the color of something is this value, or the margin for this something is this value, or the height of something is this value. So properties is just the term of art used in the CSS world to describe key value pairs, just like attributes is the word used in the world of HTML to describe their key value pairs. Same idea for as far back as the dictionaries with which we introduced this here topic. Now, where can you go about using properties, and how can you go about using them? Well, it turns out there's going to be different ways of applying properties to elements inside of a web page. And you're going to have to specify as the developer how to select those there elements. And with the wave of a hand, let me describe there as being type selectors, class selectors, ID selectors, and attribute selectors, some of which we will see over time. And all this means is that we're going to use slightly different syntax when we want to refer to different parts of a web page. To do that, though, we're going to need to tell the browser that we want to include some CSS in our page. So here again is that sample HTML that represents really the simplest canonical web page that we can create. This one's just saying hello title and hello body. And if we make room in the head now, it turns out that there can be more than just a title inside of the head of a web page. In particular, you can have a tag called style, which is wonderfully named because inside of that tag, you can put some of those CSS properties, key value pairs, targeting specific elements inside of a web page. Alternatively, we're going to see that instead of using a style tag, you can actually use another tag up here, namely a link tag, which unfortunately is poorly named insofar as it doesn't refer to a hyperlink in the way that the anchor tag and the href attribute does that we described earlier. This one allows you to link in the contents of a .css file, which contains all of those same properties, the key value pairs, but instead of typing them out in your actual web page, you can actually put them in a separate file and include them more readily. But it turns out there's yet another way to stylize web pages, and that's with style attributes. And we'll begin our story there, if only because it's the simplest way to begin. But then, as we often do, we'll try to improve the design thereof. So let me go back to VS Code here. Let me create a new file called home.html and pretend like we're creating a home page for someone, like John Harvard here on campus. Let me go ahead and save a few keystrokes, as often, by copying and pasting my hello world code into home.html. I'll change the title of the page, I'll get rid of hello body, and I'll hide my terminal window so that we can now build a home page for John Harvard. Let me imagine this home page as having like 3 big sections, like a sort of header for the page with John's name, maybe a middle of the page that just welcomes people to his web page, and then a footer with like copyright information or things like that. Pretty common format for a web page, sort of something up here, something down here, something down here. We just need a generic structure with which to play with some HTML and then some CSS. So let me do this. Let me create a paragraph tag at the top of the page that just has John Harvard's name. Let me create a second paragraph below that that says, welcome to my home page, exclamation point. And then below that, let me have a footer of sorts that's just copyright John Harvard in this way. Now, let's go about improving this in a few ways. Well, one, this is a very quick and dirty copyright symbol. It turns out, as an aside, that there's other ways to express characters in HTML, one of which is through what are called HTML entities. Because it turns out, for some symbols that aren't easily typed on your keyboard, you can actually use some special syntax. And I'm going to use this, ampersand, pound symbol, 169, semicolon. And here, VS Code is actually highlighting it, colorizing it so I can see what's going on differently. This is an HTML entity using code number 169, which if you look it up in a book or a manual online, you'll see that this means an actual copyright symbol. So a little C with a circle around it. So useful and commonly used here in the US. Not as easy to type on the keyboard. You could alternatively go Google it, highlight, copy it elsewhere, and paste it in using Unicode. But HTML entities are commonly used still to represent certain symbols like these. Now, let's look at what this web page resembles. Let me go back to VS Code in my directory index. Let me click on home.html. And here we have John Harvard's web page. But notice that there are indeed 3 paragraphs of text, although it's not really appropriate to call these paragraphs because they're really just different parts of the page or divisions of the page. So we'll come back to that. But all of the font sizes are the same. Like there's no making John Harvard big and bold here. I don't really need to see the copyright as big as it is. So you might want to start stylizing content like this. But we have, with HTML alone, structured this web page. So how can I add some style? Well, first I'm going to introduce a style attribute before then taking it away. I'm going to go to my paragraphs start tag here. I'm going to add a style attribute, and I'm going to change, for instance, the font size here. So font-size, large, semicolon, close quotes. Then on this tag here, I'm going to add another style attribute equals quote-unquote font-size, medium, semicolon, close quotes. And then lastly, just to keep this going, style equals quote-unquote font size, small, semicolon, close quote. Now, strictly speaking, I don't need the semicolons in this particular case. I'm doing it just for uniformity, as we'll soon see. But they're kind of back, just as they were kind of back when we introduced SQL and the end of those statements. But here now, I seem to have added some attributes, the style attribute, to each of these tags that's stylizing the aesthetics of this here page. So the structure is the same, but now the aesthetics are different. In fact, let me go back to my other tab. Let me reload the page, and I should see now these new styles. And indeed, it's a little subtle, but the top line is bigger, the middle line is medium, and the bottom line is indeed smaller. Well, it'd be nice to kind of center everything. So what else can we do with this page? Well, let me go back to VS Code here, and let me, after the semicolon, do something like this. Text-align, center, semicolon. And just to save some time, let me go ahead and highlight everything I just added and paste it inside of those same quotes. So now notice I have more properties. And indeed, that's what we're looking at here. This key, font size, has a value of large. The whole thing, therefore, is a property. And I've used it in 3 different ways with 3 different values, large, medium, and small. This is another property over here, text-align, whose value is center. And I'm using that again and again and again, separating them both, again, by semicolons. Let me go back to my page here. And you might imagine, as soon as I click reload, now everything is nicely centered.
Nice.
So I'm taking some baby steps toward improving the aesthetics of this page, but I dare say I haven't really done this in the best way. Let's chip away at this further. So paragraph tags are fine, but semantically they're really meant to describe paragraphs. And I'm hard pressed to say that John Harvard is a paragraph and copyright is a paragraph. But these are different regions of or areas of my page. So I think what I'd like to do here is just be semantically a little more appropriate. So I'm going to change my p tag to be a little more generically div tags, which stands for division, which is kind of a generic rectangular region of the page, which in some sense is adding less information, but we're going to improve upon this further. This is a very common way to structure pages. In fact, when we glimpsed Harvard's HTML earlier, there were lots of divs in the page because someone who designed that page was kind of laying things out in rectangular regions. And even though there's no visible rectangles, that's kind of what's going on here. It's one rectangular region on top of another, 3 of them in total. But I don't think this is the best design still. Why? Well, let me go back to VS Code here. And even if you're brand new to CSS, let alone HTML as well, you might have noticed that I kind of copied and pasted, and that generally has not been a good practice. It suggests that I'm just doing something redundantly. But what if I did this? What if I factored out that redundancy, that commonality, the text-align center as follows? Let me go ahead and delete it here. Let me delete it here, and let me delete it here, and let me propose that all 3 of these divs actually have a common parent from which they descend, so to speak, namely the body tag. So technically, I could go up here and do a style attribute on the body tag equals quote unquote, and then put text-align, center, semicolon. And the idea of, again, the document object model with CSS is that that text alignment, centering it, will cascade down to the child elements, which are div, 3 of them in this case, so that all of them are still centered. Let me go back to my other tab here and reload, and even though nothing has changed visually, underneath the hood, I have factored out that commonality and applied text-align center to all 3 of those same elements. Now, technically, there's other ways to do this. If I didn't want to stylize the whole body, especially if this is a bigger page that has other elements inside of it, I could actually introduce a parent of my own. It is perfectly reasonable to create a parent div, which after all is just sort of a generic container there. Let me close it all the way at the bottom here and indent it accordingly. And then let me go ahead and indent all of these 3 divs inside of that new div to make the point that if I don't want to apply a style to an entire body of the page, that's fine. I can similarly just do text align center right here, and that too would achieve the same result. And indeed, in Harvard's page, we might have noticed there were lots of divs, not only side by side, but nested inside of each other, perhaps, it would seem, for similar reasons as well. Now, strictly speaking, I don't have to do it this way. Let me go back to the body approach just to keep it simple. But let me propose that as useful as these divs are, as these containers, whereby each of them describes a different region of the page, I could probably help the internet. I could help search engines. I could help AI. I could help screen readers, for accessibility's sake, understand a bit more about what I mean for each of these divisions of the page to be. So instead of just generically saying div, what I'm actually going to do instead is use 3 semantic tags. And by semantic tags, I just mean HTML tags that are not as generic as div or paragraph, or P for short. I'm going to specify that John Harvard is actually in the header of this page, and I'm going to close that tag accordingly. That welcome to my home page is in the main part of the page, and I'm going to close that accordingly. And the footer is actually in a tag called footer itself, and I'll close that one as well. Now, these are not tags I'm just making up. These are officially in the HTML specification, but they mean exactly what they say. The header for the page is probably useful. It's kind of informational, where you are, whose web page this is. But the main part of the page is generally the juicy part that has actual information that isn't just logos and headings like that. The footer, though, typically tends to be less important. It's got useful stuff, but it's probably not as important as the header and or the main part of the page. So these tags capture those semantics. And the upside is when Google or Bing show you sample search results, or when ChatGPT or some future technology is learning about what this page is saying, it could logically give a little more weight to the header and the main part and less weight to the footer. So you don't see excerpts from the footer, which might not generally be nearly as useful. But what else can we do now that we've introduced these tags? Let's actually take a step toward improving the design of this page too. Generally speaking, it's not the best practice to combine the structure of your page with the aesthetics thereof. In other words, it's not the best idea to combine HTML with CSS all in the same place. Because when I glance at this page, it would be nice if my HTML really did just structure the page. And then somewhere else, maybe in a different file altogether, all of the aesthetics are. Why? Because this way, maybe, I could use different CSS properties for night mode, for dark mode, and for light mode, so that depending on the time of day, the colors of the website might be a little bit different. I could maybe use different style sheets for different devices or different types of browsers or the like. So it'd be nice to kind of factor out the stylization from the web page itself. That said, this is sort of a swinging pendulum in industry. There are technologies that actually do combine CSS with HTML, the argument being that the closer they are, the easier it is to maintain the code and understand what is affecting what. So you'll find arguments in both directions when it comes to the separation of HTML and CSS. But let's take a step towards separating them, at least for our desktop and laptop-based purposes here. Let me do this. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these style attributes, which is unfortunately going to ruin the aesthetics of the site and make it very generic as before. However, I'm going to reintroduce those properties in a different place. As I proposed earlier, we can make room in the head for not just the title, but a proper style tag. So not an attribute, but a tag. And inside of that style element, what I'm going to put is a few different properties. But the way I'm going to do this is by selecting parts of the web page that I want these properties to apply to. So when I said earlier there's these different selectors in the world of CSS, this is a fancy way of saying there's different syntax you can use to apply automatically certain properties to certain tags or certain types of tags. So let me go back to VS Code here, and what I'm going to do inside of my style element is this. I'm going to specify that any tag called body, which happens to be one and only one, should have all of its text align in the center, semicolon. Unfortunately, curly braces are back when using CSS in this way, not unlike C. But again, we're not programming. We're really just defining key value pairs. any tag called header, I want to have some slightly different properties. Font, size, colon, large. Any tag that's called main, I want to have font, size, colon, medium. And then any tag that's called footer, I want to have font, size, colon, small. Now, even though this is taking up way more lines of code, it is a step toward keeping my styles separate from the content of the page. And eventually, if you are on the same page as me here, where this might be leading, we can probably copy and paste all of those styles into a separate file. Then two people can work on the same website at once. One person can do structure, one person can do style. We can do the whole light mode, dark mode thing by having different files for different times of day. Feels like a design opportunity. All we've done, though, is select tags by way of their names here in this particular case.
Hey,
if
Ryan.
I again go back to my other tab and reload the page, it's actually not going to look any different, but underneath the hood, it's indeed been structured and styled slightly differently. And here's where we have an opportunity to actually reintroduce those developer tools for yet another reason. Let me right-click or control-click on the page. Let me click Inspect. And as before, you can see all of your HTML at left under Elements. But notice at right, all this time, even though I didn't mention it before, you can also see styles for things as well. So for instance, if I click on the body, watch what happens at right. I will then see a summary from my browser of all of the CSS properties that are being applied to the body of the page. One of them is apparently text-align center. And then there's two others, even though I didn't type these out, display colon block, margin colon 8 pixels. And that's the user agent style sheet. Long story short, there are certain default properties that browsers have, be it Chrome or Edge or Safari or Firefox or the like. And what I'm seeing in italics there for the body are some of the default stylizations. And this is why, therefore, some browsers will render the exact same HTML slightly differently unless you try to standardize it somehow with your own CSS. But what's nice about Chrome's developer tools and any of these browsers is here too. Instead of going back and forth between VS Code and my browser tab and reloading each time I want to see a change, I can change things in real time, not permanently, but in the browser's memory. So if I'm just curious and I want to see what this text would look like when aligned to the left, I can type in left, and notice it immediately jumps there. If I delete that altogether, notice that Chrome actually shows me a drop-down menu, a la autocomplete, of all of the possible valid values for the CSS property. So it's a great learning technique, too. I don't have to constantly look things up or watch a video online. I can let the browser tell me what are the possible values if I'm learning or I just forget what I can possibly type there. I can go ahead and undo that, go back to having things centered, but I can actually play around a bit further here. Suppose I want to change the font sizes. Well, let me go down to header here, and notice what we meant was font size large for header. Well, honestly, reasonable people are going to disagree what small, medium, and large mean, certainly across Google and Microsoft and Apple and other companies. So what does large actually mean? Well, I could be more specific. If I really want this to mean something, I can say something like 18 point. Which you might be familiar in the desktop publishing world. I can change this to maybe 24 point to make it even bigger. Or I can even deal in pixels. I can say something like 36px for pixels. And I can get really crazy, like 360. And you see that now it doesn't even fit on the screen. But look how nice it looks because it's being dynamically sized. So I can just kind of play around with these various styles in the inspector itself. So in short, within Google's developer tools, and again, almost every browser has this nowadays, the network tab showed us the underlying HTTP stuff. The elements tab shows us the underlying HTML. And now the styles tab shows us the underlying CSS. And there's so much more, but so wonderfully useful when trying to modify or learn this here stuff. Let me go back now to VS Code, and let me propose to introduce another way of selecting elements. Previously, I mentioned there was this whole list, and what we've just done is select things by way of their type. The type of the tag was body, or header, or main, or footer. But there's these things called classes in CSS too. It's not really the same thing as classes in Python or Java or other languages if you're familiar. But classes in CSS are our own keywords that we can invent and associate our own properties with those keywords. So for instance, if I wanted to reuse styles like text-align center and font size large and font size medium and small, I don't have to associate them with specific tags. I can create my own nicknames for these, if you will. Let me say that anytime I want to center something, no matter what tag it is, I'm going to use a class called centered. Anytime I want to make something large, I'm going to use a class called large. Anytime medium, I'm going to make a class called medium. And anytime small, I'm going to make a class called small. Now, why the dots? The humans who invented CSS needed to come up with some way to distinguish the types of tags or the names of tags from classes. And so you simply use a dot to indicate, hey, browser, here comes a class whose name I'm making up on my own. So anything with a dot represents the start of a class name. How do I use these? Well, let me scroll down to the bottom of the page. And now there's no association yet with any of those class names with this HTML. But what I can introduce now is a class attribute where I can specify, OK, I want John Harvard to be large. And I want the main part of my page to be medium. And I want the footer of my page to be small. And by the way, I want all of this to be centered. So you can create these reusable words, and you can invent the words subject to a few constraints on what the characters you can use. But now you have a set of classes, so to speak, that you can use on these tags and maybe bunches of others. They're not that useful at the moment because this web page is so darn simplistic. But you could certainly imagine in Harvard's web page and Yale's web page and Google's web page, where they have so many darn tags, might be very useful to use these classes and reuse them so you don't have to copy and paste any of that text as we saw before. And in fact, let's take this one step further. It's a little silly that I keep scrolling up and down. Let's just move all of this CSS to its own file. So let me highlight that and cut it. Let me get rid of my style tags altogether. Let me create from my terminal window a file called styles.css, though I could call it anything I want. Let me paste those lines in there. And VS Code nicely left aligned everything for me. That's it, out of sight, out of mind. Let me close that file. And then inside of the head of this page, instead of a style tag, let me do in link href equals styles.css. And the rel tag for the relationship here is that of style sheet. It's generally the only one you'll use. And this is the kind of thing you might have to look up or copy paste. But href refers to the file that you want to link in, essentially copy paste, but automatically, like an include in C or an import in Python. And the relationship of that file to this one is that of what's called a style sheet, a sheet or page of properties. So let's now perhaps use these techniques to make things that are a little prettier now and a little more visually interesting. Let me go ahead and do this. Let me close out this home page here. Let me go ahead and open up our old file called link.html, which previously looked like this when we left it at Yale. Let's actually undo that phishing attack and change it back to harvard.edu for consistency with before. And let's try to bring this link to life in a slightly different, more colorful way. If I open this page, recall, we did see the link. If I close my developer tools, go back to link.html, notice it was underlined by default, which was great because it made very visually clear that it is a link and not just text. And it was purple, which is the default color in most browsers to indicate, yes, it's a link, but it's one you've already visited. So purple means you've visited it before, and blue typically means it's a link, but you have not visited it before. So that's a default. But suppose I want to override that and make things more crimson or red in nature. Well, let me go back to VS Code here. And in VS Code, let me go ahead and, just for the sake of discussion, let me take one step backward, just because it's easier and more efficient during class to reintroduce our style tag. But if you're convinced you could and probably should move this stuff to a separate file, that's indeed the best practice. But I'm going to keep it simple in the same file. Let's go ahead and start to stylize this anchor tag as follows. My anchor tag, abbreviated A, is going to have the following property associated with it. A color of, how about red, semicolon. And now let me go back to the tag here, reload the page, and indeed, it's now red and underlined here. If you want to get rid of the underlying, you can. I could additionally, inside of these curly braces, say text decoration, which is another property we haven't yet seen, whose value is now going to be none. If I go back to my browser tab, reload the page, it's still red, but not underlined. And that's fine, and that's pretty common nowadays. But here, too, for accessibility's sake, you should be mindful of the fact that depending on the quality of someone's vision, they might not be able to distinguish red from black or red from some other color. So in terms of accessibility, you should make sure that if you're removing telltale signs of links like underlines, make sure there's sufficient contrast between the colors that you're indeed using. So in fact, let me go ahead and leave that alone for now. But let me propose that I'd like to at least show when a user on a laptop or desktop hovers over the link, let me at least underline it then. This is less useful on mobile because on mobile you don't really hover as much as you do tap or not tap. But just so you've seen how in CSS this is done, I can do this too. I can have a selector that says a:hover, which is a special keyword that the browser knows about, which means when I'm hovering over with my cursor, an anchor tag, change the text decoration temporarily to actually being underlined. And if I go back to my browser tab, reload, notice that I get now some interactive behavior. Anytime I hover, you can see the line appearing. For better or for worse, this is how you can implement a bit more dynamism then with your here content. And the fact that it's an anchor tag means that it's going to apply to any of the anchors, any of the links in this here page. If I don't want that to be the case, let me propose this. Let me propose that instead of doing this, I want to define some properties as follows. Let's go ahead and undo this. And in this page, let's suppose that we have a visit to Harvard or a visit to href equals https://www.yale.edu, close bracket, Yale. So the page is a little longer now, but the sentence now reads visit Harvard or Yale with 2 different links. How can I now stylize these a bit differently? Well, let me go ahead and do this. Inside of my style attribute, let me specify that I want the Harvard link to be red. How do I do that? I'm actually not sure I can just yet. But what if I do this? If I know I want to stylize this tag, let me actually give it a unique identifier. There's different ways to do this, but perhaps the most deliberate would be give this anchor tag a unique identifier called Harvard or whatever you might want to call it. And let's do the same over here. Let's add an ID to the second anchor tag that calls this tag Yale. And I'm using lowercase by convention. What this allows me to use is yet another type of CSS selector. Not type or name, not class, but ID. I can create a unique identifier that allows me to say target the Harvard element.
So what's the difference between the ID selector as described, right? What's the difference between assigning an ID and assigning a class? So in in home, we assign a class to the actual tags themselves. Okay, so classes are assigned to tags, whereas IDs can be assigned to specific, what's the difference? Because actually the ID is within the anchor tag. An ID is typically used to identify it for other things. A class is used for styling the HTML element. Okay, so like yesterday we talked about how elements are the total opening and closing of the tag. So whatever is embodied within the whole, tag opening and closing is the element. There is the head element that has a head opener and a head closing tag. Right? So classes define these total elements of body or header or main, whereas IDs will attach to like a more singular scope of like a singular anchor element tag, like a single link, assign an ID to this and manipulate it. But the class takes over the overarching HTML element. I think I get what you're saying, Jacob. Am I along the right lines here? I'll continue on here while you guys are typing away.
How do I express that? Well, instead of using a dot, I actually use a hash symbol here, and I say hash Harvard, and then inside of those curly braces, I can say color red. And I can do hash Yale, and then inside of those curly braces, I can say color blue. And actually, just to bring back memories, for better or for worse, of hexadecimal notation, and Photoshop, as we discussed when we discussed multimedia and representation thereof, I can actually use hexadecimal codes. So instead of saying red or blue or any other color, I could say hash symbol here, unrelated to the hash symbol next to the class name. Now we are combining color codes with CSS. I can do this, FF0000, which is a lot of red, no green, no blue. Down here I can say hash symbol, no red, no green, lots of blue. And those represent essentially the same colors. Down here, I still want to do I'm going to not bother actually with the text decoration anymore. Let me go back to my page here. Let me reload. And now now it's getting a little prettier, a red Harvard, a blue Yale, with those two links targeted specifically. Now there's yet other ways too. A third way would be to target a element based on the value or presence of one of its attributes, aka an attribute selector. But I'll wave my hand at that, since surely you'll see eventually in documentation elsewhere, if you go down this road with web design, how you might target those as well. But we don't have to do even these selectors. IDs are meant to be unique. So maybe it would be better to say anytime I have something related to Harvard, let's use a class called Harvard. Anytime I have something Yale related, let's use a class called Yale. So here then, instead of saying ID, I can say class equals Harvard and class equals Yale. And now, even though it's not relevant for this simple example, I can use that class on a different elements again and again. An ID is meant to be unique, and it is a mistake on your part or my part if you use it in multiple places.
Oh, okay. Here we go. He got to it here. Okay, so let's go ahead and jot that down. So a class overarching stylistic choice or style that is applied to many HTML elements to basically limit encode. So ID selectors. So we need an example here for the class selectors. So example, what are we going to say here? Right, the class used the dot notation. So it was like dot class, right? As a better example. Opens up and it has font size 12 pixels, color red, right, yada, yada, yada. And then that would close like so.
All right, so much like with HTML, which really only had tags and attributes as its basics, similarly is CSS relatively simple in design with just these properties. And it too has a much larger vocabulary of things and features that you can use throughout your web page, but we'll wave our hand at that so that you pick up that vocabulary over time via online references or the like. But for now, let's just focus on how you can really leverage CSS to take up a notch the aesthetics of your page and make things much prettier than I myself have been doing thus far. Let me go back to VS Code, and let me copy from the code I brought with me today a phone book example that gives us the simple form of a phone book with 3 people. Let me go ahead and open this file as it's already been made. And in this file here, after I close my terminal window, is this: a phone book that is apparently made up of an HTML table. Inside of that table is a couple new tags that I'm introducing for formality's sake here. One is calledthead for table head, inside of which is the heading of the table with a table row, tr, with 2 th tags, table heading for short. Long story short, even though the table I made earlier to mock up the visual of a phone keypad is perfectly correct structurally, it turns out if you want to distinguish the header of your HTML table from the rest of your HTML table, you can do so by introducing thead up here and tbody down here. So implicitly, what I was doing earlier was treating everything as the table body with no fancy header up top. But what is different here is that by using th for the table heading here instead of td, it's a clue to the browser that this actually has some semantic meaning. This is the heading of the table, and maybe it, for instance, should be bold-faced by default. But we've seen already we can start to override that. As for the body of this table, it seems like it's a phone book with 3 people, Yulia, David, and John, with our now familiar numbers, each implemented in a table row. If I go back over to my directory index and reload, I'll now see phonebook.html. And even though the data's there, honestly, it's not particularly pretty, if you will. In other words, within this file here, I've got all of the data I care about, but certainly no CSS. And while I could go in and start using some selectors and adding some CSS, some key value pairs for properties to make this prettier, maybe with some borders and the like, I bet I can do better by standing on the shoulders of someone else who's made a third-party library, who's thought about what would be the prettiest way to display an HTML table. And this gives us an opportunity to discuss what are called frameworks in the world of web development in particular. A framework is really a library written by some third party that just makes it easier to frame your own project, to sort of structure your own project so that you don't have to implement a lot of basics, particularly aesthetic, that so many other people have had to deal deal with as well. Better to focus on the problem you actually care about, the business you're building, the product you're creating, rather than worry too much about the aesthetics thereof. And among the more popular frameworks in the world of HTML and CSS is something called Bootstrap, which is a library that anyone can use and incorporate into their websites, really by just including one or more HTML tags, and suddenly everything would seem to look prettier. And in fact, let me go ahead and do this. Let me copy an example I brought with me as well. This one, a second phone book example. If we open this new and improved version of phonebook.html, notice a few things. In the head of my page, I've included a link tag this time, but it's not referring to a file of my own, like styles.css from before, but rather it's referring to an absolute URL that ultimately, per the end of this URL, points to a file somewhere in the cloud called bootstrap.min.css, where min is just saying that this is a minified file, which means a lot of the white space has been deleted from it just to shrink the file's ultimate size, but it is in fact a CSS file. Meanwhile, lower down in this file, if I close my terminal window here, we'll see in the table tag that I've used a class attribute, the value of which is table. Why is this? Well, according to Bootstrap's own documentation, they just told me if I want to use their stylization, their style sheet, be sure to add a class of table to your own HTML table, so that they don't presume to change the aesthetics of all of your tables, just the one to which you've added this class. Meanwhile, the documentation also advised me to add scope equals column and scope equals column to two of these table headings up here. But otherwise, the data itself is exactly the same. So let me go back to my browser tab here, which previously looked like this with no CSS whatsoever. And honestly, even if I'd added my own CSS, you've probably been underwhelmed as to how pretty my own pages look. Probably would not have looked much better. But simply by including Bootstrap CSS file and adding those attributes that I pointed out, notice what happens when I now click reload on this newly stylized phone book. Suddenly, it looks much better. Still black and white, so if you were expecting even fancier, you're not going to get it. But it's still black and white. But notice the font is no longer the default. It's no longer some serif font, but it's some sans serif font with less decoration. Notice that name and number have been automatically boldfaced. Notice that clearly there's more padding or spacing among all of these values, so arguably it's easier to read. Notice that there's the gray line separating each of the rows from each other. And long story short, it's just prettier. It's nicer to look at, but you and I don't have to figure out how to adjust the white space, how to adjust the bold facing, how to adjust the font size, and all of that. The library takes care of that for you. Moreover, there's other features you can include here. If I read the documentation, it turns out that I can also add table-striped to the class attribute. So we haven't seen this yet, but it turns out that the class attribute's value can be one word, or two, or three, so long as they're separated by spaces. So if I read the documentation, turns out I can apply two classes to this table, the second one now being table striped, and watch what happens when I now reload the page. I now see that every other row is very beautifully striped. Slightly more usable, slightly prettier to look at, and maybe more helpful then to discern what data is on what row. And let me wave my hands at the rest of this, but suffice it to say that by way of frameworks like Bootstrap, you can actually make your website faster and better and prettier without having to reinvent lots of wheels yourself. That said, if you're particularly artistically inclined and want to fine-tune things, you can create some or even all of the CSS that you're using. But for more on Bootstrap, all of its documentation is at this URL here. And in fact, in many of CS50's own projects, do we ourselves use Bootstrap and its classes so we don't have to figure out all of the aesthetics thereof. Now, with all that said, just one language remains. This one, a proper programming language that, for better or for worse, is going to bring back functions and arguments and loops and conditionals. But before we get there, let's take a 5-minute break. And when we return for the final time, we'll dive into JavaScript. All right, we are back. And we now take a look at the third. All right, we are back, and we now take a look at the third of our 3 languages today, that of JavaScript, but specifically one that's a programming language. And by programming language, I indeed mean that we'll get functions and arguments and loops and conditionals and more back. But let's take a quick tour through JavaScript, just as we did Python. much more quickly, because what's ultimately important to us today is that you have a sense of what JavaScript can do, but we will really only scratch the surface of this here language. Not only can JavaScript be used in some of the ways we'll see today, but it's also increasingly being used on the server as well to generate entire websites and applications and more. So we'll give you a sense really of some of the basic syntax and basic capabilities, but ultimately defer to your future endeavors, your own final project perhaps, to apply JavaScript and explore it all the more. So just as we did earlier, let's consider the simplest of web pages here in HTML alongside its own DOM, or document object model, which represents, again, how that HTML might be structured in the computer's memory once the page has been downloaded and loaded by the browser. Unfortunately, what you're looking at here is a very static web page, one that simply says hello title and hello body. But wouldn't it be nice if that DOM could evolve over time? After all, in C and then in Python, we experimented with data structures via which we can add and remove data dynamically based on user input and more. In fact, almost any web page you've used nowadays has some form of dynamism involved, such that it's rare for it to be a static website. Odds are something is changing. Case in point, if you open up your Gmail inbox or Outlook inbox and just sit there staring at it, odds are, for better or for worse, more email will appear. More email will appear. And previously, we described those kinds of inboxes as stacks, which they rather are underneath the hood. But visually, how are those stacks of emails being implemented in HTML? Well, we've seen already that it's probably some form of tabular data, a bunch of TRs, 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 one for each email that you might receive. But if it's coming from the server once, how can you possibly get more emails? So long story short, thanks to server-side technologies, Python among them, and client-side languages like JavaScript among them, can you actually, behind the scenes, get more and more data from the server in order to update the web page and in turn the underlying DOM. So how can we go about doing this? Well, let's see what some of the things are that JavaScript can do. We have conditionals in JavaScript, whereby, such as in Scratch, when we had x less than y as a Boolean expression, in JavaScript here at right, that kind of code is now going to look like this. Unfortunately, the parentheses are back, the curly braces are sometimes back, but to look less than y. We have conditionals in JavaScript, whereby, such as in Scratch, when we had x less than y as a Boolean expression, in JavaScript here at right, that kind of code is now going to look like this. Unfortunately, the parentheses are back, the curly braces are sometimes back, but this is perhaps the simplest way to think about the structure of a JavaScript version of a conditional. It actually looks, at a glance, exactly like C. If we consider an if-else in Scratch here, at right now with JavaScript would be exactly the same, just as we saw, in fact, in C. And similarly, if we have an if, else if, that too might look exactly like this. But unlike Python, which rather abbreviated else if, in JavaScript and in C, it is else if with a space in between. All right, what about variables in JavaScript? If you actually want to be able to store something in your own variables, well, in Scratch, recall that we might have set a counter equal to an initial value of 0 like this. In JavaScript, there's a few ways to do it, but the simplest way to describe this is by using a new keyword, let, which is like a very polite way of asking the browser to give you a variable. Let me have a variable called
Let
counter,
me have counter,
and initialize
please.
it to a
Let me
value
have
of 0. Semicolons, though, are now back.
I want it now,
that's a bit of an
Daddy.
overstatement, because JavaScript can actually tolerate the absence of semicolons, at least in many cases. However, for consistency, we and I will continue to use them here. How about if you want to increment that counter by a value of 1? Well, in JavaScript, you can do this by setting counter equals to counter plus 1, the equal sign being, of course, our assignment operator from right to left. You could also do counter plus equals 1, just as in C and in Python. And if you like this in C, plus plus and minus minus are now back. So in JavaScript, you can do that to increment or decrement a variable respectively. What about loops? Well, in Scratch, we might have had something like this to repeat 3 times. In JavaScript, it similarly is going to be very similar to C. But instead of saying something like int for integer in C, we indeed say let in JavaScript to create a variable like I. Do this, say, 3 times while incrementing with plus plus I along the way. What else might we now do? Well, we might have a forever block here in Scratch that does something, of course, forever. In JavaScript, you can also say while true, where true is back to being lowercase here, and that will ensure that whatever's between those curly braces will happen again and again. Meanwhile, if we revisit the canonical form of this HTML, Where can we actually put JavaScript code? Turns out there's a few different places, and there's a few different reasons to use one place or another. But just so that you see in the range of possibilities, especially when you then see suggestions in online documentation for JavaScript libraries, you can put a script tag in the head of your page, just like we put a style tag or a link tag up there as well as the title. And inside of that can go some raw JavaScript code typed out by you. Of course, I've proposed that it tends not to be ideal to commingle one language with another, and so there's other ways to do this too. You can actually have a script tag, this one with a source element that will allow you to specify another file name or even another URL from which you want the JavaScript itself to come. What's a little weird, though, about the script tag here, even when used with a source attribute, is that you'll see that I've closed the tag nonetheless with an open bracket / script close bracket tag at the end of this line to make clear that there's no JavaScript inside of this element. Indeed, it's only coming from that same source. As an aside, you will also see, and there are also reasons to, sometimes put a script tag in the body of the page that is below most everything else in the page, or a script tag with a file reference therein, even at the bottom of the page, just because order of operations can indeed matter. But these are sort of subtleties that we'll try to avoid for now, simply focusing on really what JavaScript itself can do. And in fact, what's perhaps most powerful about JavaScript, and what nicely brings us rather full circle back to where we started the class in Scratch, JavaScript, in the context of browsers, can be very much event-driven. So just like in Scratch, when we actually had actual events, and even a block, if you discovered it, called broadcast, where you could have one sprite somehow signal to another, on really what JavaScript itself can do. And in fact, what's perhaps most powerful about JavaScript, and what nicely brings us rather full circle back to where we started the class in Scratch, JavaScript, in the context of browsers, can be very much event-driven. So just like in Scratch, when we actually had actual events, and even a block, if you discovered it, called broadcast, where you could have one sprite somehow signal to another, in JavaScript, and specifically in the context of browsers, there's just so many events or things that can happen. For instance, you might change the value of a field in a form. You might give something focus by clicking on a text box. You might drag something from one place to another. You might put your mouse down or mouse over something. On a mobile device, you might put a finger down, thereby touching down on the device. So long story short, all of these keywords that you see here represent events that happen inside of a browser that JavaScript as a language can be used to listen for and respond to. And as such, you can use JavaScript to make very interactive.
Don't do it, David. Don't go next. I'm not ready.
You see here represent events that happen inside of a browser that JavaScript as a language can be used to listen for and respond to. And as such, you can use JavaScript to make very interactive and responsive web pages, whether that's to go get more emails from the server or to grab more of a map if you're clicking and dragging while using Google Maps or the like. So let's begin to scratch the surface today only of what JavaScript can do. Let me go back to VS Code here. Let me create a new file here called hello.html. And in that file, I'm going to go ahead and save a few steps by first copying as a starting point some of my earlier code. Let me close my terminal window, change my title as always to just hello, and get rid of now that default body. And let's go ahead and whip up a very simple interactive page that just says hello to someone more interactively, ideally letting them type in their own name, just as we've done in so many languages prior. Let me go ahead and create a form tag in here. And inside of that form, let's give myself an input. And just to practice what I've been preaching, let's turn autocomplete off as before. Let's turn on autofocus so I don't have to click in it manually. Let's give this input a unique identifier for reasons that we'll soon see, like name, although I could call this thing anything I want, but I do want the person's name. Let me use the placeholder text of name so it's clear to the user what I'm prompting them for. And the type of this text box, even though this is the default, shall indeed be text. What else do I want to do? Well, let's keep it simple and just have an input type equals submit so that I get a button, which you've seen in a couple of different ways. Let me go back to my other tab, reload the page, and I'll see now hello.html. Inside of this file, I see a very simple form. If I type in my name, though, and click submit, notice that my URL has changed if I zoom in up here, and there's indeed a question mark, which suggests that something was submitted from the browser to the server, but there's nothing after that. There's no something equals something. And why is that? Well, even though I gave the text box an ID of name, I didn't give the text field a name itself. In other words, I did not say, if confusingly, name equals quote unquote name, just as I did name equals quote unquote queue or name equals quote unquote email. And that's fine, because we've certainly seen inputs before that don't actually send anything to the server. They just result, for instance, in the case of a button, in the form itself being submitted. So this is to say that if an input in a form does not have a name, it's simply not going to be submitted to the server. But that's OK, because my goal at hand today, at least for this example, is to say hello to the user, but not server side. We don't yet have the means yet, until we reintroduce some Python to generate content server side. I want to do everything client side. And so just to be clear, just as HTML is downloaded from the server to the browser, CSS is downloaded from the server to the browser, JavaScript, as we are currently using it, will also be downloaded from the server to the browser and executed client side in your own Mac, your PC, or your phone. Which is to say that any of the data we get from the server has to come all at the get-go. Until then, it gets executed client side. So if I want to greet the user based on what they type in their name as, I need my client-side JavaScript code to go grab that name from the form and display it on the screen for me. So how can I do this? Well, it turns out that the form element can take another attribute that we've not yet used that's actually reminiscent of those keywords on this list here. Indeed, notice on this list is a submit event. And indeed, in HTML, I can use an onSubmit attribute in my code to do most anything I want. For instance, suppose I want to call a function. I'm going to call a function called greet. However, I don't want this actual form to be submitted. I actually want to return false here as well after a semicolon, just to make clear that what I want this form to do is no longer to submit to the server, but rather greet the user by calling some function called greet, and then return false. And return false, per the documentation for how browsers and JavaScript works, just means that the form never goes to the server. So how can I go about using this here code? Now, this greet function doesn't actually come with JavaScript, but I can create it myself, just as I could create functions in Scratch, in C, and in Python. In fact, let me go up to the head of the page and keep things simple, create a script tag in there above my title, and then inside of that script tag, let's go about defining a function in JavaScript. It's a little different from C, it's a little different from Python, but the end result is really the same. In JavaScript, you literally write the keyword function, which means, hey, browser, here comes a new function. You then give that function a name. I'll call it greet. You then specify in parentheses whether or not that function takes any arguments. And for now, I'm going to say no, none. And then inside of curly braces, I can implement the actual function. Well, what do I want to actually greet the user with? Anything for now. Let's keep it simple. Let's actually use JavaScript's built-in function called alert and just say something like, how about hello, comma, world, close quote, semicolon. So the alert function, unlike greet, does come with the language. Here, I'm going to go back to my browser, reload the page, type in DAVID, and now I'm going to click submit. And notice what happens. I now get a fairly ugly pop-up, which is built into the browser itself, but toward the middle of it, it indeed says hello, comma, world. Now, that has nothing to do with the name I typed in, but we can fix that. Let me click OK.
Look
go
at
back
us.
to VS Code. And before I say hello world, let's do this. Let's create a variable called name and set it equal to the following function, though it's admittedly a mouthful. Document dot query selector quote unquote hash name dot value semicolon. There's a lot to unpack here. So what's going on? Well, recall that from Python, you can chain certain things together. And recall from C and Python, you can use the dot operator to go inside of structures or objects. So that's a lot of what's going on here. So it turns out there's a special global variable when using JavaScript in a browser called document, which refers to the document itself, the DOM, if you will. And if you go inside of the document, it comes with a method, aka function, called query selector, capital S, lowercase q. And what query selector lets you use, funny enough, is the exact same syntax that CSS uses to select elements. So you can select elements in the page by way of their name or type, like body or header or main or footer. You can select elements by way of classes or by way of their IDs or other techniques as well. Now recall earlier that I did give this HTML input an ID of quote unquote name. And so if I want to refer to that ID, recall from CSS that the symbol is the hash symbol and then the name of that identifier. So what's happening here is I'm saying go into the document, use the query selector method, look for the element whose unique ID is name, and please grab its value. That is whatever the human typed into that input, and store it from right to left in a variable called name. Now all I have to do is include it in my alert to the user. And just as in Python, there's different ways to do this. What I'm going to go ahead and do first is our old friend, the plus operator, after a space inside quotes, and append to, or concatenate to, hello, comma, space, that person's name. Now notice too, what I've deliberately done here is the following. In the world of C, double quotes are what you use for strings and single quotes are what you use for characters. In the world of Python, double quotes or single quotes can be used for strings, otherwise known as strs. In JavaScript, same thing is true. Double quotes or single quotes. I will say conventionally, probably most JavaScript programmers use single quotes for better or for worse for strings. So that's the habit I'm going to adopt here, if only to be consistent with that. Let me now go back to my other browser page, reload.
I use double quotes.
Type in again my name, David, and notice now when I click submit, now I get, if I zoom in,
whose name should we
hello,
use?
comma, David. So
Ryan,
I've created a string there dynamically. Notice too, once I dismiss this by clicking OK, if I go back up to the URL bar, notice that I have not actually submitted the form. No question mark, no key value pairs have appeared in the URL. All of this is indeed happening client side. Now, what more can I now do with this? Well, this arguably is not the best design because, as before with CSS, I'm kind of commingling one language with another. And I've kind of baked into my HTML some very explicit JavaScript code. Can I get rid of this? Well, I can, in fact, do that in a couple of different ways. Let's go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and get rid of the onSubmit stuff, leaving, therefore, just the form and the two inputs inside of it that I had previously. Just to avoid a problem, let me go below this now and add a script tag after getting rid of this one up here. So I'm going to deliberately move everything to the bottom of the page for now, just so that this works without creating a problem. And what am I now going to do? Well, it turns out in JavaScript, you can actually use JavaScript to query the DOM for specific elements and then listen to events that might happen with those elements. You don't need an onSubmit attribute. You can do all of this in code. So how might I do this? Well, let me do this. Let me create a JavaScript variable called form, set it equal to document.querySelector, and then let me go ahead and select the one and only form in my page with quote unquote form. I don't need a hash symbol. I don't need a dot because I'm selecting that element by its type.
By type.
Or its name, which in this case is form. All right, what can I now do with this variable? I can now use form dot and a new method that we haven't yet seen. It turns out in a web page, once you have a variable or some other value that represents an element on the page, you can call a method called addEventListener. And as the name implies, that allows you, after the page has been created, to start listening for some special event on that element. That event being drawn from a list like this one here, including the submit event. So how can I do this? Well, this function takes one argument, which is quote unquote the type of event that you want to listen for. And I could listen for any number of things, but the one that's relevant for a text box in this case, or one that's relevant for a form with this text box, is going to be quote unquote submit. And then I can call a function that actually gets called whenever that form is submitted. Now, greet, again, does not yet exist because I deleted it earlier. But notice what's happening here, which is not something we've done much before, except a little bit in Python. I am calling the form variables addEventListener function, aka method. I'm telling it to please add an event listener on the submit event. And whenever that event is fired or triggered, please call this function greet. So I'm passing in the name of the function. I am not using parentheses after the name of this function because I don't want to call greet now. I want to register greet as an event listener, so to speak, so it's called later by its name by the browser for me. Now, how can I go about implementing greet? I can do something as before. So above this code, so before I use it, let's say function greet, open paren, close paren. then inside of this function, let's do something similar to before. Let name equals document.querySelector, quote unquote, hash name to get at the element with that unique name, with that unique ID, dot value. And below that, let's go ahead and use our alert function saying again, hello, comma, space, plus, to use the concatenation operator, that particular name. Now, there's one other thing I do want to do here, because by default, when forms are submitted, they indeed get submitted to the server, but that's behavior that we wanted to preempt. The way we prevented that last time was by adding return false inside of the event handler, but there's actually a better way to do that. It turns out that when adding an event listener using a function called greet, you're actually going to be passed in an argument, whether you want it or not, that I can refer to as event, or E for short, but I'll be more explicit with event. And it turns out that that argument that gets automatically passed in for you whenever that event is triggered allows you to call event.preventDefault, which is a more programmatic, less hackish way than previously, whereby I just returned false. This is literally telling the browser, when you get this event, let me do my own thing by alerting the user, hello so-and-so, but prevent the default behavior, which we know now to be submitting the form itself. So if I haven't made any mistakes here, and I go back to my browser, reload this page, type in DAVID again, and click submit, there we have it again. The browser has shown me hello, comma, David. But this is getting a little verbose, honestly. And in fact, there's more JavaScript-like ways to do things like this. And let me propose to do this. Notice that I am, one, using a variable called name here, and then only using it in one place. That's totally fine and very reasonable, but we know from C and Python that's not strictly necessary. So if you're more comfortable, you can get rid of that whole variable, like such, and then just concatenate to hello, comma, space, the return value of that same function. Now, this fits on the screen nicely. It's still pretty readable. I would wager that this is reasonably well designed, but if this line of code got much longer, we probably do want to go back to the version with an actual variable. But we still want to prevent the default. But what about this line here? Notice that I'm calling a function called greet, even though I'm only doing that once. So we can actually do something in JavaScript that's kind of neat that we can't quite do in the same way in C or in Python, at least not nearly as elegantly. It turns out that if I'm only using the function greet once, I don't really need to give this function a name. In fact, let me just kind of get rid of that there and get rid of this here. And let me propose this. This will look ugly at first, but I'm going to grab this whole function and I'm going to literally copy and paste it as the second argument to add event listener. I'm going to go ahead and clean it up a little bit to be a little conventional here. I'm going to move my curly brace to this line. I'm going to get rid of this space. But now, this is actually pretty compact. Let me get rid of some of the blank lines. And notice what I'm now doing. I'm still using a variable called form to get the one form in the page. I'm then telling that form to add an event listener for the submit event.
Wait,
but
whoa, what happened? I don't know what happened.
This will at least not nearly as elegantly. It turns out that if I'm only using the function greet once, I don't really need to give this function a name. In fact, let me just kind of get rid of that there and get rid of this here. And let me propose this. This will look ugly at first, but I'm going to grab this whole function and I'm going to literally copy and paste it as the second argument to add event listener. I'm going to go ahead and clean it up a little bit to be a little conventional here. I'm going to move my curly brace to this line. I'm going to get rid of this space. But now, this is actually pretty compact. Let me get rid of some of the blank lines. And notice what I'm now doing. I'm still using a variable called form to get the one form in the page. I'm then telling that form to add an event listener for the submit event. But because I want to tell it what function to call, what you can do in JavaScript, which you can actually do in Python too, is you can pass in an anonymous function, otherwise known as a lambda function, that still might take an argument, but does not need a name. Why? Because if you're using it only one place, why bother even giving it a name? So the only thing I've done is I've deleted the name greet and simply calling it function and then passing in specifying the argument it should take. But the next two lines are exactly the same. And the only thing you have to be careful about is, notice I've got the close curly brace here and then the close parenthesis, the first of which closes this curly brace, the second of which closes this first parenthesis. And if you really want to tighten things up, we don't really need the form variable. Let me get rid of that line of code and change that variable to be this one-liner. And so even though this is getting a little complicated visually for those unfamiliar with JavaScript, this is fairly conventional syntax for doing a whole lot of things at once in this particular language without unnecessarily using variables and the like. Now, let me demonstrate that still this here works. If I reload the page and type in my name, David, and submit, we do get that pop-up. But let me do what I did previously, which was to put this whole script tag inside of my head tag at the top of the page. So I'll make room for it up there. Same exact code, but now the script tag is above the form tag. Let me go back to my browser here, click reload, type in DAVID, and click submit. And dang it, we're somehow back to the broken version, where still my name, because I added that name attribute earlier, is getting submitted to the server, but I don't want this getting submitted to the server. What is now going wrong? Well, let's see if we can't diagnose this. Let me go back. Let me right-click or control-click and inspect, and show you one final tab today, which is that of the JavaScript console. It turns out that in the console tab of your developer tools, you can see error messages from languages like JavaScript. And if you see anything red like this, odds are, I'm afraid, you messed up. Or in this case, I messed up. And let's see if we can infer what's wrong. Cannot read properties of null reading add event listener. Unfortunately, just like Clang, just like Python, the error messages in the computer world are not always that clear, especially for first-time programmers. But it at least seems to relate to line 7, character 43 of hello.html. So let's go back to this line here. Line 7 here is in place. Why might the form be null? Well, notice that this global variable here is referring to the whole document. Query selector is selecting some element from that document. But if that element doesn't yet exist, this function call here, which I've highlighted, will return null. So this is kind of like saying null.eventListener, which just like our time from C, kind of makes no sense. You can't dereference null. You can't do anything with null. So something has gone wrong. Now, why is that? Well, much like Python, much like C, these languages are typically read top to bottom, left to right. And unfortunately, if you define the form on line 16, but you try to access the form on line 7, it's just not going to work. And so what you're seeing in JavaScript's console here is that it's null because it hasn't yet been read. Now, previously, I avoided that problem by moving the whole script tag to the bottom of the page, just sort of avoiding the problem. But there is another way to do it. And you'll see in lots of libraries, even though it's a bit of a mouthful. Let me go into hello.html here and add one more event listener, which I'll type out myself. Document.add event listener. And I'm going to listen for a very special event that you have to capitalize just right. DOM content loaded, quote unquote.
Wait, what is going on here? I'm like so far behind.
It turns out that when adding an event listener using a function called greet, you're actually going to be passed in an argument, whether you want it or not, that I can refer to as event, or E for short, but I'll be more explicit with event. And it turns out that that argument that gets automatically passed in for you whenever that event is triggered allows you to call event.preventDefault, which is a more programmatic, less hackish way than previously, whereby I just returned false. This is literally telling the browser, when you get this event, let me do my own thing by alerting the user, hello so-and-so, but prevent the default behavior, which we know now to be submitting the form itself.
Okay.
So if I haven't made any mistakes here, and I go back to my browser, reload this page, type in DAVID again, and click submit, there we have it again. The browser has shown me hello, David. But this is getting a little verbose, honestly. And in fact, there's more JavaScript-like ways to do things like this. And let me propose to do this. Notice that I am, one, using a variable called name here, and then only using it in one place. That's totally fine and very reasonable, but we know from C and Python that's not strictly necessary. So if you're more comfortable, you can get rid of that whole variable, like such, and then just concatenate to hello, space, the return value of that same function. Now, this fits on the screen nicely. It's still pretty readable. I would wager that this is reasonably well designed. But if this line of code got much longer, we probably do want to go back to the version with an actual variable. But we still want to prevent the default. But what about this line here? Notice that I'm calling a function called greet, even though I'm only doing that once. So we can actually do something in JavaScript that's kind of neat that we can't quite do in the same way in C or in Python, at least not nearly as elegantly. It turns out that if I'm only using the function greet once, I don't really need to give this function a name. In fact, let me just kind of get rid of that there and get rid of this here. And let me propose this. This will look ugly at first, but I'm going to grab this whole function, and I'm going to literally copy and paste it as the second argument to add event listener. I'm going to go ahead and clean it up a little bit to be a little conventional here. I'm going to move my curly brace to this line. I'm going to get rid of this space. But now, this is actually pretty compact. Let me get rid of some of the blank lines. And notice what I'm now doing. I'm still using a variable called form to get the one form in the page. I'm then telling that form to add an event listener for the submit event. But because I want to tell it what function to call, what you can do in JavaScript, which you can actually do in Python too, is you can pass in an anonymous function, otherwise known as a lambda function, that still might take an argument, but does not need a name. Why? Because if you're using it only one place, why bother even giving it a name? So the only thing I've done is I've deleted the name greet and simply calling it function and then passing in specifying the argument it should take. But the next two lines are exactly the same. And the only thing you have to be careful about is, notice I've got the close curly brace here and then the close parenthesis, the first of which closes this curly brace, the second of which closes this first parenthesis. And if you really want to tighten things up, we don't really need the form variable. Let me get rid of that line of code and change that variable to be this one-liner. And so even though this is getting a little complicated visually for those unfamiliar with JavaScript, this is fairly conventional syntax for doing a whole lot of things at once.
Throw at someone at the very start of JavaScript
without unnecessarily using variables.
Come on, man, don't do this to us.
Now, let me
brutal 4
demonstrate
lines right there
that
for
still this
a
here
noob
works. If I
JavaScripter.
reload the page and type in my name, David, and submit, we do get that pop-up.
Okay, do we get that for ours? No, we still have an error somewhere in ours. Where do we have an error? Anyone see our error? Where do we have a bug? Spaceman says, oh, no, I read that one. The onSubmit event is used to trigger server calls so you prevent that default action. It is unless you use defer. Realistically, your JavaScript is going to be in a separate file. Gotcha. Prevent default makes it so they will need a name or something entered in a form. You can also add an error message to clarify it to users requires name. It is best practice to put your JavaScript in the head. It doesn't have to be in the head, but it can be at the bottom. It will just hit the script tag on the first load first. It will just hit the script tag on the load first. It's about loading the DOM before you place the script tag. It's about loading the DOM, the document, before you place the script tag at the bottom. Carlos, awesome, dude. Carlos Salcedo, for those that aren't knowing, he's following my same path for the Python crash course. He's been reading. He's on chapter 10. Just a few days ago, he was on chapter, I think it was 7 classes, and then 8 after that on, what's 8 on functions? I can't remember. It's got to be, functions got to come before classes, no? Is there a name input somewhere in the HTML markup? Name input. I have a name input here, right? Name is name. Oh yeah. Hey, keep it cool. How's it going? I got a science fair regionals today. Regionals. Awesome, dude. Good luck on that, man. You're gonna do great. Hope you do well. Add event listener is a function that takes in 2 arguments. Okay, so then why does he only have 1 in his? What else should I put in here? Is he putting in this as the second argument? Oh, hold on. He might be. Document.
Now, let me...
Why do I have so much more here, I feel like? Document dot event listener. Oh, here we go. I don't need this. So I'm adding it here. So this line here should not be there in general. Okay, so now let's go here. Line 6 again. Let's see here. Who should we use today? He doesn't even have that in his thing though, right? So if I go, who should we use? Let's see. Let's go. Keep it cool. Keep cool. No. Dang it. No, not happening. So he's got document.querySelector, add event listener, submit function event, alert hello, plus document.querySelector, name.value, event.prevent default. Check the Discord. Okay, I'll check it. Lots of really good stuff in here. Sweet. Where is it? Here we go. Wait, which one was it? Comrade Kibble? Okay, here. Let's bring this over. Okay, so this is what we got here. So this is a simple HTML form that collects user input, assuming. Okay, so form input. First input field for users to type their name. Type equals quote text. ID equals quote name. Placeholder, enter your name. Autocomplete off prevents browsers from suggesting previous entries. Okay. Autofocus makes the field select on when the page loads. ID name2 gives the element a unique identifier. Name equals quote name is used when submitting data to servers. Placeholder shows a hint inside. Okay. Gotcha. You submit button. A button that triggers the form submission when it's clicked on. So you have a button within this form. Type submit. Oh, so when, okay, I got you. So just by default, the button's not going to do anything, but by giving it a type submit, it's going to submit to some server. Now you have to probably on the back end within whatever Python it is, accept that data from the server and do something with it. But we're doing a whatever it was, a prevent default to avoid that action, so we can throw that alert just to the screen saying hello. Okay. So then now we get into our script here, where we have step 1, wait for the page to fully load before running the JavaScript. So you put the script down at the bottom, so you wait for the page to fully load. The DOM content load event fires when the HTML document is completely parsed. The DOM content loaded fires when the HTML document is completely parsed. Add event listener takes 2 important parameters. So add event listener. The first parameter. Oh, so you're saying that when the DOM loads, then you fire this function? The document content loaded event fires when the HTML document is completely parsed. Okay, so after the HTML document is completely read, there must be something that's sent by the browser that says, okay, I've completely read the DOM. That is an event that has been signaled. I'm catching that event with this listener, right? I'm looking for this event, and on that event, when I'm fully loaded, I'm running this function. Okay, sweet. Disregard what I said about invalid arg, but you do have to have 2 args in the add event listener. You haven't got the part yet where he says how putting the JavaScript in the head like that now breaks it, and then shows how to fix it. Okay, got you. The DOM hasn't loaded yet, so when you're querying for the form event, it doesn't exist. The DOM hasn't loaded yet. Oh, okay, gotcha. So when I'm putting the script in the head, that's why it breaks, because I'm querying for the DOM to load, but it's not loading, so okay, I got you. Thank you. That's a really good explanation, Baseman. Move script out of head or defer it. Got you. I use Cloud to help me write the comments, so mileage may vary. You got it. You tag events types on events on the front end. Add an event listener as a function. Yeah, I can see it takes 3 arguments too. The first event is the name of the event to listen for. Yeah, the second is the function that does the stuff. Yeah, exactly. Right. So we're going to wait for the document to become fully loaded. Once it's fully loaded, once that signal is read by the listener on the document, we're going to run this function, which what we'll do is find the form element via the query selector on the document. So we're going to, the query selector finds the first parameter or element given in the parameter. So it's going to find the first form. You define it with a const variable here, which we haven't seen yet. Const declaration, a variable type. Set up a listener for when someone submits the form. This creates a trigger that runs our code when the form is submitted. The submit part means watch for form submissions. The function event that contains the event code to run when submission happens. So we're adding another event listener on submit, right? Because up in the top we have the submit button that has the type it's going to submit. So we're looking for that event type. On that event type, right? We're going to call function event. Now, this might be getting a little bit too ahead of myself, but now what happens if you have like a form or something, or multiple forms on the same page with multiple submits or something, like, you have like a checkout button or a add to cart button or all these different submits? How do you individually capture them by, not, by, you're kind of just catching the first, form. Well, what if there's multiple forms within the page? How do you, catch the second one, let's say? How do you index the second event form or whatnot? Or query selector, I'm sorry. So then we event listen for the submit, and we do a function on it. Perfect. We prevent the default. We get an input, which is the name from the query selector. We get the value from that input using dot notation, and then we create the alert. Okay. Sweet, that was awesome. Shout out to Comrade Kibble, Jacob Allen. You're awesome, man. Thanks so much for that breakdown. You guys are wanting access to this. Let's Comrade Kibble, could you put a copy of this in the CS50, the HTML CSS community here? Could you throw that in there? You guys want to jump in that Discord, it's in the description completely for free. It's got tons and tons of resources from not only myself and my personal roadmap for learning and what I've done to convey an authentic beginner point of view and perspective for learning how to code on my own after my 9-to-5 job as a chemist with a degree in human biology and a minor in chemistry, but as well as a lot of other viewers on the channel who happen to be, computer science majors themselves, actually in the field as software developers currently. So a lot of great resources and people, you can reach out to and ask, personal questions to, right? Either one, you can, I don't mind. You could spam post it in either one of those. You could put them all of them, honestly. It pertains to everything. It's a really good umbrella kind of breakdown of explaining things, whether it be in the CS50 community or the CSS HTML community. Thanks so much for that, man. I think each event would have a unique ID, but that's a good point. You can give different elements unique IDs and query the elements by ID rather than querying all elements on the same type. Okay, got you. Just back to that unique ID part. Query selector hashtag unique ID. Okay, so we would just like this. So we're getting the name out of here because we gave it a unique ID. So it's going to get this one. Now, this is nested within the form query selector. So, but I don't think it has anything to do with this form per se. I think it's individually extracting the HTML value of ID name, right? Okay. So then let's take this script and let's move it to the bottom of our code, right? And so now if we run this, we inspect. Okay, no errors. Here we go, guys. No errors, no bug. Here we go. Okay, who wants to be our crash dummy here? Next chat wins. Oksav. Oh! Boom, boom, boom. Let's go.
Demonstrate that still this here works. If I reload the page and type in my name, David, and submit, we do get that pop-up. But let me do what I did previously, which was to put this whole script tag inside of my head tag at the top of the page. So I'll make room for it up there. Same exact code, but now the script tag is above the form tag. Let me go back to my browser here, click reload, type in DAVID, and click submit. And dang it, we're somehow back to the broken version, where still my name, because I added that name attribute earlier, is getting submitted to the server, but I don't want this getting submitted to the server. What is now going wrong? Well, let's see if we can't diagnose this. Let me go back. Let me right-click or control-click and inspect, and show you one final tab today, which is that of the JavaScript console. It turns out that in the console tab of your developer tools, you can see error messages from languages like JavaScript. And if you see anything red like this, odds are I'm afraid you messed up, or in this case, I messed up. And let's see if we can infer what's wrong. Cannot read properties of null reading add event listener. Unfortunately, just like Clang, just like Python, the error messages in the computer world are not always that clear, especially for first-time programmers. But it at least seems to relate to line 7, character 43 of hello.html. So let's go back to this line here. Line 7 here is in place. Why might the form be null? Well, notice that this global variable here is referring to the whole document. Query selector is selecting some element from that document. But if that element doesn't yet exist,
above,
this function call here, which I've highlighted, will return null. So this is kind of like saying null.eventListener, which just like our time from C, kind of makes no sense. You can't dereference null. You can't do anything with null. So something has gone wrong. Now, why is that? Well, much like Python, much like C, these languages are typically read top to bottom, left to right. And unfortunately, if you define the form on line 16, but you try to access the form on line 7, it's just not going to work. And so what you're seeing in JavaScript's console here is that it's null because it hasn't yet been read. Now, previously, I avoided that problem by moving the whole script tag to the bottom of the page, just sort of avoiding the problem. But there is another way to do it. And you'll see in lots of libraries, even though it's a bit of a mouthful. Let me go into hello.html here and add one more event listener, which I'll type out myself. Document.add event listener. And I'm going to listen for a very special event that you have to capitalize just right. DOM content loaded, quote unquote. And then I'm going to go ahead and call another anonymous function that simply does all of this stuff together. At the very bottom of what I just added, I'm going to add another, I'm going to add the close curly brace and another close parenthesis to now close this curly brace up here that I just added and this parenthesis here that I just added. So this too is more of a mouthful, but what is DOM content loaded? I mean, it kind of...
Okay, so because he is calling the form below, in order to avoid this error and keep the script in the head above the form declaration or define, he declares an add listen event on the document itself and calls for the DOM content loaded event to be arisen, right? And then you'll call the function. So rather than which will wait for the entire document to be parsed, as I think it was Jacob or someone said, maybe it was Outlaw Delta, sorry if I got that wrong, and then it will run this form query.
Does what it says. When the DOM's content, the entirety of it, has been loaded, then can you go ahead and execute these lines of code. How do you know what lines of code to execute? Well, here too, I've defined an anonymous function in JavaScript, which just allows me to contain inside of these curly braces the lines of code that I want to execute. Not now, but eventually, when the DOM's content has loaded. So this is to say that even in these simplistic examples we've seen already, JavaScript very heavily tends to use these anonymous functions. Or really, people who write JavaScript code tend to heavily use these anonymous functions, if only because it tightens things up And typically, once you have some experience with programming in this or other languages, you'll get more and more familiar with this. Even though at a glance, for the first time, this admittedly looks way more complicated than the problem it's actually trying to solve. Now, that said, just like with CSS, we can get rid of all of this stuff. Let me highlight and cut that out. Let me delete all these new lines. Let me go into my script tag, and let me pretend for the moment with a source attribute that I have a file called scripts.js. And I could imagine now going into a file called scripts.js, pasting all of the code I just cut out of this file, and then just like CSS, allowing one file to refer to the other. So in other words, you can ultimately go ahead and implement that same paradigm of separating one language from another in JavaScript as well. All right. That was a lot, but let's now focus not so much on writing as much code like this, but looking at some examples that I brought with me to demonstrate what more we can do with JavaScript. In my terminal window, let me go ahead and grab a 5th version of this file from my source8 directory. That's going to look a little something like this. In hello.html now, which I wrote in advance this time, we have some very similar code such that I'm listening for the DOM content to be loaded. I am defining a variable, in this case called input, because I wanted to find a textbooks on the page. And I'm using another event listener. And we've seen it on this here list, not just submit, but for instance, key up, when the human's finger comes up from the keyboard just after having typed something. Let's see for the moment, before we dive in further to how this event is being used, what this page now looks like. If I close my developer tools and reload the page, notice that the submit button is gone, but I still have a text box. And watch what happens when I start typing like the letter C, or A, or T, or if I delete, 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 W, O, R, L, D, delete, 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 delete. And then there's a default value here as well. So notice now it's sort of automatically updating the DOM of the page as I'm typing. In fact, let me do this. Let me reopen my developer tools with inspect. Let me go to the elements page by default. And notice the P tag here. At the moment, in the browser's memory is the phrase hello, comma, whoever you are. Let me start to type my own name now instead of cat or world or anything else, D. And notice that not only am I seeing hello, comma, D on the screen, notice that the DOM, as represented by the Elements tab, has been dynamically updated as well. If I type in now an A, notice what happens in both places too. The DOM gets updated again. VID, notice that, and it's flashing to draw your eye to it. I'm updating the DOM in memory. Meanwhile, if I close this and open up the page source, recall that this is a static version in here. There is no mention of DAVID in the actual HTML. That's coming from me, the user. So if we go back now to VS Code, let's look at how this works. Again, on line 10, I created a variable called input that just uses query selector to find the input element, the text box. Then I registered an event listener on that text box for key up. So this thing responds as soon as the finger comes off the key. I want this function anonymously to be called whenever that key goes up. I, inside of this function, define a variable called name, and I use the query selector to get another element on the page called P. Well, where did that come from? Well, let me open the page source again, and notice at the bottom of the page is not only the form, which is super simple, no submit button even, but there's also an empty paragraph tag that I just put there as a default element to fill with my content. Let me go back to VS Code here. And notice that once I've got that, I've got room for the person's name. So what I'm going to do is this. If the input has a value, if the text box has something typed in, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go inside of that name, the so-called paragraph. I'm going to change its inner HTML. Capitalization is important here. Lowercase inner, all caps HTML. And I'm going to change it to be hello, comma, something. More on that in a moment. Else, if there's no input value, that is, it's blank, so this Boolean expression is false, let's just change the inner HTML to be hello, comma, whoever you are. That's the default value. The last thing to tease apart then is what is going on here. This is horrible to look at, I will admit, and is the ugliest of the syntax we've seen. But just like in Python, we have those format strings or F strings where you can put the F and then quote marks, and then curly braces inside to interpolate the value of some variable. JavaScript has something similar, except it's much more ugly to look at. Specifically, you use backticks, which vary in their location based on whether you have a US English keyboard or something else, but a backtick at the beginning and a backtick at the end. And inside of those backticks, if you want to interpolate the value of some variable, you do use curly braces, but you also use a $sign. So it's like Python syntax, but worse. But it's the exact same idea.
What?
There's nothing really complicated beyond that other than remembering or Googling the syntax for that technique. So at the end of the day, the result is that we get this sort of automatically updating page that updates one keystroke at a time based on what the user typed in, this time based specifically on the key up event instead of submit. Well, let's do one other. Let me go back to VS Code here, open up my terminal after closing hello.html. Let me copy from my source directory today something called background.html. And now let's go back to my directory listing here, reload, and see background.html and click it. This is very simple. But let's see if we can infer how this works. I've got 3 buttons, and they're not rectangular as much as they are square, but that's just because the labels R, G, and B are so short. But watch what happens. R turns my background red. Green turns it green. B turns it blue.
Look at that.
Well, how is that happening? Well, let me go back to VS Code here, and let me actually open now this file, background.html. And notice what's going on here. Inside of my body, I've got 3 buttons, each of which has a unique ID.
Unique
red,
IDs, red, green,
or
and blue for the
and
buttons.
each of which has super short labels, R, G, and B, in all caps.
Okay.
But then I have a script tag. Notice first I'm creating a variable called body that's just grabbing the element from the page, the type of which is body, and there's only one of those. And then notice this. I've got 3 nearly identical lines of code starting here. I'm going into the document, using query selector to find whatever element has a unique ID of red, per the hash symbol. On that element, I'm adding an event listener for the click event, which is, again, on our list of events that you can listen for in JavaScript, in addition to submit and in addition to key up.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Here, then, I'm listening for click, and I'm calling this anonymous function when that R button is clicked. And when it is, I execute one line of code. And here's where today kind of comes together in full circle. I can, inside of my web page, using JavaScript, modify the CSS of my page too. I can go into that body element, access its style attribute, which is a variable inside of the body, and that exists because that's how browsers work.
Okay.
And I can access the background color property inside of that body tag style. It's like accessing its style attribute, if you will. And I can set it equal to quote unquote red. Or I could do hash ff0000, but I kept it simple with quote unquote red. The next 3 lines of code are the same thing, but for green. The last 3 lines are the same thing, but for blue. Okay. The only thing that's weird here is where did background color come from? Because it's lowercase b and capital C. Unfortunately, this is maybe not the best design historically. In CSS, we saw text align, we saw color, we saw a couple of other properties as well. Unfortunately, there is in CSS a CSS property called background-color. I just didn't happen to use it just yet. Unfortunately, CSS uses background-color. JavaScript necessarily uses background color with capital C. Why? Well, in JavaScript, you can do math, like in most languages, and unfortunately, the dash is already used as a minus sign. So unfortunately, in JavaScript, if you wrote this property as background-color, this would be like trying to subtract
you have to do that with the text align as well?
From background. So background minus color, which makes no sense. So left hand and right hand weren't really communicating, it seems. So the solution was just to use camel case, so to speak, like a camel with a hump, and capitalize the C, but get rid of the hyphen. And there is a mapping, therefore, from CSS properties to JavaScript attributes in this way. So that's all that's happening. And in fact, we can see this again in our inspector. Let me reload the page to go back to white. Let me again open up the developer tools. Let me click on the body of the page, which currently has no attributes. And at right, there's no styles being applied to it other than the defaults from the user agent style sheet. But watch what happens now under element.style and on the body tag itself. When I click R, a style attribute will suddenly appear programmatically on the body tag with a value corresponding to
red.
Background-color, red. Notice over at right here, too, we see a summary in Chrome's developer tools of exactly that. If I click on G, if I click on B, I can see exactly the same thing happening for each of those colors. So here now we have the ability with JavaScript not only to alter the DOM of the page, the contents of it, what the user is seeing, but also it would seem the CSS thereof. What more can we do? Well, let's look at one other example that sort of evokes a tag from yesteryear. Let me go into my source directory and grab an example called blink.html and show you in this code herein. If I hide my terminal window, we've got a function in this file inside of my script tag called blink, which apparently toggles visibility of greeting. But what does that mean? Well, let's try to infer here. There's a variable called body, which is set equal to the return value of query selector. And we're checking this question. If the visibility of that element is hidden, then change the visibility to visible. Else, change the visibility to hidden. Now, this, too, is one of these left hand and right hand. We're not intercommunicating. I have no idea why the opposite of visible is not invisible, but the opposite of visible in CSS is hidden, for better or for worse. So what's really happening here is we have a conditional, an if-else construct, that's saying if the visibility is hidden, make it visible, but if it's visible, make it hidden, back or forth. How is this being used? Well, here is another function that comes with JavaScript. There's a global variable called window, which refers to the browser window itself. That comes with a method called setInterval, capital I. That function takes two arguments, the first of which is the name of a function to call. Notice again, not using parentheses, because I don't want to call blink on line 22. I want to pass the name of that blink function to this setInterval function. And 500 is the second argument. That refers to a number of milliseconds. And what setInterval does, as you might imagine, is it will now call the blink function
every
500 milliseconds, or half a second.
Okay.
So the effect, if I go back to my browser tab, close my developer tools, and click now on blink.html, is a resurrection of a tag that actually existed when I was growing up, whereby you could literally do open bracket blink, close bracket, and you could make your web page's text blink like this. Even worse, there was a tag called marquee that would scroll your text across the screen, very hideously so. And in fact, among all of the features of HTML, among the few that have been removed over the years are exactly those two tags. But with JavaScript, we can bring them back now in this way. The point of which really is to demonstrate, again, how much control we now have over over our DOM and our web pages thanks to JavaScript. Let's do one final example here. Let's go back to VS Code here, open my terminal, and let me copy in one last file from today's distribution code called autocomplete.html. And let's go ahead and open up autocomplete.html here in VS Code. Well, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that there's a body of this page which just has a text input that's of type text with a placeholder of query. Below that, there's this empty unordered list with nothing initially, much like there was an empty paragraph tag previously, so I could put hello so-and-so. Then there's this file here using a script tag referencing large.js. So I actually need that file too. That's in today's distribution too. So let me grab large.js, which, if we open that up, might look somewhat familiar. It is a JavaScript version of the dictionary from problem set 5, wherein you implemented the fastest spell checker that you could. So there's 100,000 plus words in this file. But notice they're structured as a JavaScript variable called words, all caps, to make clear that I mean for it to be global. It's using square brackets, as on line 1, because that, it turns out, much like Python, is how JavaScript indicates an array. But in JavaScript, they're again called arrays instead of lists. And then I just have this comma-separated list of strings using double quotes, but I could have used single quotes for all 100,000 plus of those words. So by including this file, this means that my script down here has access to that words variable. What am I doing? Well, I'd create a variable called input and set it equal to query selector's return value, just so I can get a variable pointing to that text box. Then I'm, again, as before, adding an event listener, listening for key up, so the finger coming up, and whenever that happens, I call this anonymous function. I first, in that function, set an HTML variable to quote unquote, so the empty string, nothing. Because what I want to do is build up a list of words that match whatever the human has typed in. And you'll perhaps see where this is going in a moment. If the user then has typed something in, there's a value in that text box, do this. Iterate over that array of words. So for each word of words. Here, too, is a JavaScript-specific feature, but it's similar in spirit to Python, sort of similar in spirit to C. But the preposition I'm using is indeed of. And I'm saying for each of the words of this words array. It's a little weird, the English, but this is how you can iterate over every element in a JavaScript array. If the current word that we're iterating over starts with capital W, so this is a function that comes with strings in JavaScript, that input value. So in other words, if the word we're looking at in the dictionary starts with the same letters that the human has typed into the text box, let's do this. Let's concatenate onto the HTML variable, which is just an empty string initially, the following HTML. Now, this too looks weird, but remember that the backticks mean that you can interpolate variables inside of curly braces. So this means add to that HTML variable another li tag and another close li tag, inside of which, though, is the word that has matched the first few characters. And do that again and again and again. And plus equals here just means concatenate, concatenate, concatenate. So we're essentially building up in JavaScript more and more and more and more HTML dynamically based on the human's keystrokes. And the very last thing I do is this. I ask the document to query select the UL element, which previously was an empty unordered list, but change its inner HTML to be equal to the li tags that I've been creating in one big variable.
Oh, okay.
So if I go back over to VS Code here, if I go back to my browser tab here and click back, and I now go into autocomplete.html, as the name suggests, this is the essence of how autocomplete exists in Google, in Bing, and in applications more generally on the web and in some mobile devices. If I type in C, I see now an unordered list of all of the words that start with C in this dictionary. If I type A, nothing seems to happen, but that's because the list is so long. If I type CAT, now notice I get every word that starts with CAT. If I type in S, now I get just 4 words, including ketchup at the end, that starts with CATS.
Ketchup.
Meanwhile, if I
Ketchup.
open up the web page's source, notice none of those words are in there. They're in the large.js file, but not in this page. If I instead close that and open up the inspector again, and I go to the Elements tab, and after having typed in cats, notice there are indeed 4 li elements there. But watch what happens. As soon as I delete mention of cats here, all 4 of those li's disappear. And now I'm back to the UL alone. So this is to say, with HTML, we can structure our web pages. With CSS, we can stylize our web pages. And with JavaScript, we can dynamically update and modify our web pages. And via JavaScript, can we therefore implement applications like Gmail and Google itself and CS50.ai and so much more, because it makes what's otherwise a very static experience in the browser suddenly dynamic. And indeed, what JavaScript can even do is make more HTTP calls to the server to get more and more data, more and more tiles from a map, more and more emails from the server. But today, we've seen just the fundamentals. Through your coming problem sets and perhaps final project, where you have an opportunity to apply all 3 of these technologies together to build the web applications and the mobile applications that you and I already use every day. That's it for CS50.
Woo!
We will see you next time.
Nice. Whoa! Whoa. All right, week 8 lecture is complete.